Hi, welcome to the small shed. This week I think the build's going backwards. See you in a minute. Right, time for an unboxing, I think. Got some goodies just arrived. I think I know what it is, but I'm not 100% certain. I think it's one of the little diversions and fripperies that are probably totally against the whole Cyclekart ethos, but I've kind of succumbed because I think it might be useful in some respects, and it's just a little bit of fun for me, I think, more than anything. And this is supposed to be all about fun. Head cables, bracket, a lot of chunks of polystyrene, a lever, bag of bolts with a gear on it, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 tooths by the look of it. Say that again. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 tooths, sorry, 12 tooth cog, and a load of bits, and the main event, which is that on a quadrant and bracket. And that is something to bolt onto the motor in some way, shape or form. In the shape of a reverse gearbox. Now, as I say, I didn't need one, but there is a little bit of mitigation in it as far as I'm concerned. Firstly, it does give a degree of reduction. I think it's 1.3 to 1 reduction down, so that will help me with my rear sprocket size workings out. And also it gives me an option. I think this will mount the back end of the torque converter on it, and then it will then drive the gear from that, and I may well at that point put a lay shaft in and drive down, and I think that will make the whole business of getting the power to the back axle and keeping the motor as far forward as possible, I think it will help it. It's not particularly wide as a unit, so that will help. That little quadrant goes on there, and then that just switches between neutral, forward and reverse, I believe. That's it, that's one way. So in one way it goes that way, in that way it goes nowhere, and in that way it goes the other way. So yeah, that's what happens there. Probably needs some oil in it, although there's evidence of oil around it. I doubt if they've shipped it full of oil, but they may have done. There is a little breather vent to go on that. Cap comes off and then put the breather vent on. Don't know how we're going to mount it. It's going to need some sort of bracketry, although they have supplied one bracket. That bracket is there for the to go there, I think. That plate bolts on there. Yep, that plate bolts on there. So that gives us the cable inlet and outlet for that. And that is the motor mount, the one mount for it that we get with the thing itself. I think that bolts across the casing like that, and I think there's an intention that you can use that to pull back and forth on a mounting to tighten the belt or the chain, depending on what you're using. I think that's the idea, but I will investigate. Until I know exactly where it's going to mount around the engine, I can't really do a lot more than that, but at least now I've got the unit. It's like everything else on this, I'm trying to build it so that anything I do is reversible, but it means I wouldn't have to do a lot of work to put a differential in or anything like that. I'm making it so that if I wanted to, I could put a differential in. I'm not going to at the moment, but I don't want to have to be doing a lot of hacking about. I'm putting it so that I've got the reverse gearbox in it, and if I don't get on with it, or I find it's a waste of time and effort and too much weight, I can take it off and I'm no worse off, because the TAV will still run the same way, and we can then just alter the gearing slightly. That is the other end of the affair, and is some form of, let's see, yes, it forward, neutral, reverse lever to go mounted into the cockpit somewhere. Nice positive action with a cover on it. So that is today's extravagance. These things weigh about £150 on average when I looked, and I was tempted for a while to, there was just that unit available like that for about 50, and I thought, well, that might be useful. It wouldn't be that difficult to sort out the cable reverse mechanism. But then I started looking into the price of the cables at about £20 a piece plus, and I still hadn't got a lever like that, so I left it. Now, what tends to happen with these things, I've noticed before, if you put something in a watching list on eBay or something like that, or even just have a passing interest in them, you start to get a load of stuff coming through from the clever bods who've spotted all your cookies and start hammering you with loads and loads of adverts for these things. And what happened was that about a week later, it shows that it pays to wait with these things. I got something through with a 20% off discount code, and when I looked and worked it through, it became apparent that it was probably the cheapest option, and I think in the end it cost me just under £120, I think. So it was worth the wait. So if there is anything like a motor or a gearbox or anything like that that you're thinking of getting, it's worth just either putting it into a basket and not doing anything with it on eBay, or putting it on a watch on eBay, or doing a couple of searches on Google, and you will find sooner or later you'll start to get things from people who are trying to tempt you into actually buying one, and you probably get a better deal than if you just dive straight in. Anyway, we'll go and what I'm going to do now I've got that, the mock-up I did the other day with the back, with the whole of the cart, if you like, and the cockpit area, was useful, but now I really need to concentrate on this drive, rear axle, and now the gearbox arrangement, to see how all that fits within the back end. So what I'm going to do is a much smaller mock-up area, just the tail section from the bulkhead backwards. I've now got a wider width on the cockpit that I've cheated to get a bit more room. That gives me a little bit more room for the motor. So I'm going to do a slightly revised tail shape onto a piece of plywood, and then I can put some verticals up round it to see where the sides will come, and then see how we can fit the package into it, because it is very, very tight. Right, so I think I've got a preliminary design worked out. Let me just get an axle or thereabouts, which will be sitting somewhere about there, as low as I can get the motor really over that axle position. Like that, something like that. So I'm going to keep the existing TAV on it rather than use the reverse gearbox as the top part of the TAV, for the simple reason that would end up with the gearbox right up on top of the engine and nowhere to go with the chain. And one of the points of this whole exercise is that the way I'm doing it now, I can probably get myself the gear reductions I need to get this whole thing a much more tight package. So we've got the main TAV on it there, which will then come off with the feed through there as a tooth belt, a tooth there on the gear, I mean, down with the chain from there to there. That chain, that cog is far too small at the moment. It would be much bigger, but that just gives a rough idea of where it'll go, and make sure that however big that is, I can still get the outlet on for the exhaust, which was, I'd got that set clocked further back, but it's not going to work that way because I wouldn't be able to get at the exhaust outlet then. And then there's a further drive comes off there down to the rear axle. Now, instead of doing what I originally needed to do, which was about a 77-to-1 reduction with a 10 tooth starting at the top, you'd need a 70 tooth on. If you did a direct drive from the torque converter, you'd need a 70 tooth on the back, which is quite a big thing. It's about 300mm diameter. And to do that, obviously, to get clearance, you're going to have to lift the motor up much higher. Doing it this way, if I come down from there, for instance, with a 10 to something like a 20 on there, that in itself has got a slight reduction in it anyway, between forwards input and the forwards output. And then I've got the gearing from there to the rear, so I'm probably going to be looking at something like a 30 tooth, 20, 30 tooth on the rear axle, depending on what size cog I have on there as well. That one is, I think, 12, so that would mean probably 24 if I can get it. I don't know, because I don't know what's available. I haven't looked yet, but it does mean that diameter comes down to something much more handleable, and the whole package is relatively short and tight. It all fits in within the revised parameters of the body line that I've got. That is the body line, so I'm well within the TAV itself. That rear hub spindle, I mean, on the gearbox is well within. I might put a bearing on this end of it, mounted off a plumber block or something to give a bit of support to it. And even the existing air filter clears there, although I'm intending to put a different carbon air filter on it anyway. I may even be able to go back to having the existing tank, and clearly the exhaust will come up over and down within this rear tail area. But everything fits in well. I'm quite happy with that. It's not too far forward. There's a possibility I can pinch a couple of inches in the cockpit area as well, and that would give me a little bit of room to move forwards there if I needed to, but I don't think I do at the moment. I think I'm pretty much there with the sort of outline concept. We'll check it all out when we make the proper wooden final test bed up. Now, after several weeks of messing around with this and looking at it and deciding I wouldn't do anything until I'd got the made a start on the chassis, I've just been having another play with the setup on the transmission, and I think I've finally got somewhere. There was always a problem with getting it in the back. I think by removing the starter solenoid I've been able to tuck the back axle just underneath the front of the engine there, so that gets it as far forward as I realistically can without going up and above. And if I go up and above, I start to run into trouble with the side fairings on the car coming in and therefore shutting it down that way. But I've got it on with the torque converter going backwards. It could go vertically. There's not any reason, I don't think, why I can't go vertical with that, so that's still an option. So the wheel comes up here at the top. That will actually make it better because it's smaller in section further back. But I've also managed now to get the gearbox tucked, the reverse setup tucked right behind the back, in front of the back axle behind the seat, and I think that will work. There's always been a problem with it in that the output shaft is further in than the input shaft, which means that your chain is always going to be inboard of this line here, and of course inboard of this line here is the engine, so you've got a problem there. So I think I'm going to have a jack shaft running across, but there's plenty of room for that under there. I've still got under the gearbox about 4 inches of 100mm, 4 inches of ground clearance. I mean, the whole thing can be lifted up a bit. I'm just trying to keep it as low as I possibly can. But that gives me the 4-inch ground clearance, keeps the weight as low as possible. There's a fairly short length of chain from the drive off the torque converter to there and back, so that should work okay. And then I've got the output shaft which will go down to a lay shaft here, run across, and I'll probably come up the other side then and be able to run a gear on that side where there's a bit more room for that, and hopefully either on here or on the other side there'll be room for a disc brake as well. There's quite a lot of room there actually when I take these supports away, because the side of the body is right out here, so there should be room for a disc brake here. Maybe that shaft on the end of the gearbox will stop that, so we'll maybe have the disc rotor on over that side, over the far side, and the drive gear over there. So I think I've finally resolved that in my mind at long last. I will now take a couple of pictures of this, because one of the problems is I keep forgetting what I've done. Take a couple of pictures and just wait for the aluminium to turn up for the chassis now. Now, as a postscript to the rear end video, I'm probably 2 or 3 months on from when I did that one, and it just shows the value of letting these things sort of lie and mature for a while, because something comes along that you hadn't thought about. Originally I was struggling with this reverse gearbox because this distance between the TAV output meant that I couldn't use the gearbox straight on the TAV, because it got in the way of the motor in whatever position I put it in, and because this output was underneath, it had to go down towards the chain wheel on the back axle, and that was restricting. It had to go forward of the engine on that basis, otherwise it would have to go through. And so I ended up getting into the possibility that I was going to have to put a lay shaft in. Then I saw a video, or no, it was a photograph that came up on one of the Cyclekart UK forum posts, and thank you Jim for that one. He mentioned these gearboxes and I said, oh, I'd already got one, and then he posted a photograph of one he'd fitted to a cart, and it was in exactly this position with the TAV running from there to there, and I already knew that that wasn't going to happen. That wouldn't possibly go, and I thought it might be the motor, the starter motor, that was causing the problem. But in fact it turns out you can get a longer TAV belt. And of course once that's done, that frees it up. I throw that away and we mount the gearbox about there solidly. We mount the motor there solidly, get the distance right between the two there, which is about, at the moment, about 11 inches instead of about 9 on the original. Well, it's about 7 actually. So I can get a longer belt, so I'll run directly from the engine to the gearbox, and then from the gearbox straight down to about a 55 tooth wheel on the axle, which is about 4.5 inch diameter, so it's 4 inch from the edge of the axle, so it's plenty of clearance there, plenty of clearance for the motor there and there. So what I've effectively done is got rid of the need for the lay shaft or anything. It has now become no different to any other setup with the TAV, that you go up to the end of the TAV, the other end of the TAV system, and then with a gearbox on the TAV there's a gear down to the back axle, and in this case all I've done is put a gearbox in the way, so that means I'll be able to get reverse. It's become much simpler again, and I can just squeeze all of this in the tail section. I might need to take the air cleaner off the carburetor. I was going to change the carburetor anyway. I'll play with that when I get there. It may be that we just make the tail, you know, 1 inch longer or something like that. As it is, I've brought this rear axle forward probably 1 inch, but it's certainly working well now, and I can start and actually meaningfully get this bolted onto the chassis frames, get the back axle mounted, and then from there you can put the gearbox in, get the chain wheel on, and then you're just left with where you put the motor, and it's a matter of whether it goes up and forwards so that the centre of gravity is higher, or where it is now it's a bit further back, so it's hanging out over the back, but the centre of gravity is lower. But I'm really pleased with that, and it just shows, as I say, don't rush into these things, because the solution can very often pop up several days, weeks later. Right, so we'll see how we get on with that when we start and get the chassis properly put together. As I said at the beginning, it's probably against all the sort of general Cyclekart ethos and direction, except for the fact that I trump it all with the having fun part, and I think that's the answer in most of these. Hope it was of interest. Look forward to seeing you next week. We'll be doing something different on the cart. I'll see you then. Bye.